Everyone's heard of the Bren gun. Most people have seen one in a movie, maybe hanging off the hip of some grizzled soldier charging through a field in a black and white film. And for decades, the story told about it has been roughly the same. A fine weapon for its time. Reliable, yes. Accurate, sure. But heavy, slow-firing, limited by its magazine, and ultimately outclassed by German engineering that favored volume of fire over everything else. That's the story. That's what people repeat. That's what gets written in the footnotes of history books where the Bren gets a sentence or two before the author moves on to talk about the MG42 and its terrifying rate of fire. But here's what almost no one actually says. The Bren gun, the weapon dismissed as obsolete before the war even ended, outperformed every German squad automatic weapon in its weight class, in nearly every practical metric that actually mattered on the battlefield. Not on a firing range, not in a lab, not in ideal conditions. In the mud, in the rain, in North Africa's sand, in the Burmese jungle, in the frozen mountains of Korea, in the streets of towns that no longer operated air-cooled light machine gun with a tilting bolt action and a top-mounted box magazine. It fired from a closed bolt, which was unusual for a light machine gun at the time, and had enormous implications for accuracy. It was designed with simplicity and reliability as core principles, not as afterthoughts. And when the British watched it work, they saw exactly what they'd been looking for. The process of adapting the design for British service wasn't instant, and it wasn't without complications. The British wanted it chambered in. 303 British, their standard rifle cartridge, which was rimmed rather than rimless, meaning it required design changes to function reliably in a magazine-fed automatic weapon. The Czechs worked with British engineers at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield to develop. Everyone's heard of the Bren gun. Most people have seen one in a movie, maybe hanging off the hip of some grizzled soldier charging through a field in a black and white film. And for decades, the story told about it has been roughly the same. A fine weapon for its time. Reliable, yes. Accurate, sure. But heavy, slow-firing, limited by its magazine, and ultimately outclassed by German engineering that favored that ammunition. You need the weapon. In North Africa, in the Western Desert campaigns from 1940 through 1943, the Bren became something close to indispensable at the squad level. The conditions were brutal for weapons. Sand got into everything. Temperatures swung from searing heat during the day to near-freezing cold at night. Lubricants that worked in one climate thickened or thinned catastrophically in another. The desert exposed design weaknesses that had been invisible on European testing grounds. The Bren handled it. Not without issues, not perfectly, but with a consistency that earned genuine trust from the soldiers depending on it. The gas system was robust enough to function despite contamination. The barrel change mechanism was straightforward enough that a trained gunner could execute it quickly, even in adverse conditions. And the 30-round magazine, often criticized for its limited capacity compared to belt-fed systems, turned out in practice to have an unexpected advantage. Magazines could be loaded with specific ammunition types for specific situations. Magazines could be partially filled and swapped without wasting rounds. And a disciplined gunner with a stack of loaded magazines could maintain effective fire for longer than the theoretical ammunition endurance of the magazine count suggested, because the Bren's accuracy meant fewer rounds wasted on misses. The German forces in North Africa were using the MG-34 primarily, and while it was effective, reports from both sides consistently noted that German MG positions were vulnerable to the same problem that plagued precision mechanisms in desert conditions. Sand and grit found their way into the intricate lockwork of the MG-34 and caused stoppages at critical moments. Not always, not inevitably, but enough to matter. The Bren's simpler operating system gave it a marginal but consistent edge in reliability under desert conditions that compounded over months of campaigning. In Burma, the comparison becomes even more striking. The jungle environment of the Burma campaign, from 1942 through 1945, tested weapons in ways that no designer had fully anticipated. Humidity so extreme that metal corroded overnight. Vegetation so dense that visibility was measured in meters rather than hundreds of yards. Mud that had a physical personality, thick and clinging and intrusive. And an enemy in the Imperial Japanese Army that was skilled, determined, and operating in conditions they understood better than the Allied forces who were learning on the job. The Bren in Burma became something approaching legendary, not because of any single dramatic engagement, but because of the cumulative record of a weapon that continued to work when conditions said it shouldn't. Soldiers who fought in Burma have described the Bren in terms that are almost affectionate, which is not a word you often hear applied to a piece of military equipment. It was reliable in a way that mattered psychologically as well as tactically. When everything else was going wrong, when the weather was miserable and the situation was confused, and the enemy was close, the Bren worked. And in the jungle, where ranges were short and the value of concentrated accurate fire was even higher than in open terrain, the Bren's closed-bolt accuracy paid dividends that the higher-rate weapons couldn't always match. At ranges of 50 to 200 yards, which was the reality of most jungle firefights, the ability to place rounds precisely mattered more than the ability to generate volume. The Bren placed rounds precisely, consistently. The Commonwealth forces fighting in Burma, including Indian Army units, Australian forces, and troops from across the empire, all used the Bren extensively. Their reports, their after-action documents, their personal accounts, consistently describe the weapon in positive terms that don't sound like people making the best of an inadequate tool. They sound like people describing a weapon they trusted. Compare this with the situation facing Japanese infantry, who were using the Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns. These were competent weapons, but they were heavier, more complex, and fed from smaller magazines than the Bren. The Type 96 used a 30-round curved magazine, similar to the Bren in capacity, but fed differently and with a more complicated top-feed mechanism. The Type 99 was an improvement, but shared some of the same characteristics. Neither weapon achieved the reputation for reliability under adverse conditions that the Bren had built by 1944. The Italian campaign brought yet another operational environment: mountain warfare, urban fighting, river crossings, mud that in some ways rivaled Burma's jungle for sheer weapon-fouling awfulness. The Italian campaign also brought the Americans into direct comparison with British and Commonwealth forces, which means there are records from multiple national military establishments evaluating the same weapons in the same conditions. American forces in Italy were using the M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle, the BAR. The BAR was a capable weapon with genuine virtues, including a relatively low cyclic rate that made controlled fire easier, and good reliability in adverse conditions. It was heavier than the Bren, and it fed from a 20-round magazine rather than 30. American soldiers who encountered the Bren often noted it favorably. Some accounts describe informal exchanges where British soldiers demonstrated the Bren to American counterparts who had heard of it but not used it, and the response was consistently positive. But the more relevant comparison remained the German weapons. By 1943 and 1944, the MG-42 had become the primary German squad automatic weapon alongside the MG-34. And in the mountains of Italy and later in the hedgerow country of Normandy and beyond, the comparison played out in ways that complicated the simple narrative. The MG-42's high rate of fire was psychologically intimidating. There's no question about that. The sound alone affected behavior. Allied soldiers who heard it for the first time reported instinctive reactions that went beyond trained responses, and that psychological effect had tactical value. You cannot dismiss it. Fear suppresses movement. Fear suppresses effective return fire. Fear keeps people behind cover when they need to be advancing. The MG-42's sound was a weapon in its own right. But psychological effect is not the same as tactical effect. And the tactical analysis of MG-42 performance in the close country fighting of Normandy and the subsequent campaign through France and into Germany reveals something interesting. The weapon's rate of fire meant that German gunners burned through ammunition at extraordinary rates. Sustained fire from an MG-42 could exhaust a 50-round belt in under 3 seconds at full cyclic rate. That meant constant reloading. That meant barrel changes, which, while faster than many weapons of the era, still required the gunner to expose himself or cease fire at intervals. And that meant that the actual practical effectiveness of the MG-42 in sustained combat was different from what the cyclic rate numbers suggested. Allied infantry, including British units equipped with the Bren, developed tactics specifically for dealing with German MG positions. And those tactics worked precisely because they understood the rhythm of German automatic weapons fire. The reloading intervals, the barrel change pauses, the ammunition supply constraints. A Bren gun team that maintained disciplined fire, placing accurate rounds on or near a German MG position, could neutralize it not by outfiring it in raw terms, but by forcing suppression, preventing effective barrel changes, and keeping the German team's heads down long enough for riflemen to maneuver. This is what the Bren was actually designed to do. Not to win a rate-of-fire competition, to provide accurate, sustained, suppressive fire that enabled squad movement. And by that measure, the metric that actually defined the tactical requirement, the Bren performed at a level that its German counterparts in the same weight class didn't consistently match. The weight class qualification matters. The MG42 system in a squad automatic role wasn't a one-man weapon. It was a two-man minimum, often three-man system with a gunner, an assistant carrying ammunition and spare barrels, and sometimes a third man providing additional ammunition and security. When you compare the total weight carried by a German MG team to provide a comparable duration of effective fire to a Bren team operating in the same tactical role, the German system comes out heavier, sometimes significantly heavier. A Bren gunner and his number 2, carrying the weapon, spare barrel, and 12 to 15 loaded 30-round magazines, were carrying a loadout that sustained effective fire for longer than the equivalent German pair could manage, in belt terms without resupply. Because 30-round magazines are more efficient to carry in bulk than belts, they don't tangle, they stack, they load quickly with practice, and they are less affected by mud and debris during loading than open belt systems. This is a logistical argument comparison. As a squad support weapon, providing sustained suppressive fire, the SATE G44 wasn't competing with the Bren. They were solving different tactical problems, and comparing them directly misunderstands what both weapons were designed to do. The Korean War gave the Bren gun a second act that deserves its own examination. By 1950, the Bren was officially considered obsolete by many defense analysts. The Americans had moved to the M1918A2 bar as their squad automatic, with the M1919A6 filling the heavier role. The Soviets were equipping their forces and their North Korean allies with weapons that reflected post-war developments. And the British Army was fielding the Bren alongside weapons that were supposed to eventually replace it. In Korea, the Bren proved that it wasn't done. The terrain of Korea, mountains and ridges and valleys, where visibility varied enormously, and where the fighting often occurred at ranges that could shift from long distance to hand in minutes, put extraordinary demands on infantry weapons. And the Bren, reconfigured for the 7.92mm Kurs and later standardized in .303, continued to perform. The Battle of a trained and determined enemy can move, Casino, from the Anzio beachhead, from Arnhem, where the 1st Airborne Division held against the SS Panzer Corps far longer than anyone had expected, from the Rhine crossing, from every campaign where British and Commonwealth infantry fought, the Bren is a consistent presence. And the consistent note in descriptions of it is that it worked. This doesn't mean the Bren was without limitations. It had them. The 30-round magazine was a genuine logistical challenge in some situations, particularly when ammunition resupply was disrupted. The weapon required regular cleaning and lubrication, and in conditions where that maintenance was impossible to perform, its reliability was affected. The barrel change, while manageable, required the gunner to expose himself or have his number 2 perform the change under fire, which in some tactical situations was hazardous. And the weight, while not excessive, was still significant over long marches in difficult terrain. But the German weapons had their own limitations, and those limitations were often more consequential. The MG34's sensitivity to contamination was a documented problem in multiple theaters. The MG42's ammunition consumption rate created supply challenges that affected tactical decisions. Both weapons required crew support that the Bren could often manage with fewer personnel, and neither weapon achieved the combination of reliability, accuracy, and operational flexibility that the Bren demonstrated across its very long service career. The manufacturing story is also worth examining, because the ability to produce a weapon in the quantities needed is part of its effectiveness as a military system. The Bren was manufactured at Enfield, at Fazakerley in Liverpool, and in Canada at the Long Branch factory near Toronto. Canadian production alone produced hundreds of thousands of Bren guns that equipped Commonwealth forces across multiple theaters. The design, while not as radically simplified as the Sten submachine gun or the Welrod, was manufacturable in sufficient quantity to meet operational demand. The MG34 was famously difficult to produce, requiring machining operations that demanded skilled workers and time that Germany increasingly couldn't spare as the war progressed. The MG42, designed specifically to address this, used stamping and simplified manufacture, but was still more complex to produce than the Bren. When you factor in the total production cost, the manufacturing time, and the tooling required, the Bren compares favorably as a military system even from a pure industrial standpoint. Canada's contribution deserves particular attention. The Long Branch factory's output of Bren guns was a logistical achievement that made the Commonwealth's operational capacity possible in ways that are rarely acknowledged in histories that focus on the weapon's performance rather than their supply. Canadian-made Brens went to British forces in Europe, to Commonwealth forces in the Pacific, to Indian Army units across multiple theaters, and eventually to the various colonial police and military formations that carried them through the post-war conflicts. Without Canadian production, the Bren story might have been very different simply because the numbers available might not have met the demand. The training dimension is another factor that gets underweighted in weapon comparisons. The Bren was designed to be taught to soldiers who were not specialist weapons technicians. The field stripping procedure could be mastered in a training session. The stoppage clearing drills were logical, memorable, and executable under stress. The magazine loading was straightforward. The barrel change was trainable, to the point where a competent number 2 could perform it in under 10 seconds, under range conditions, and within acceptable time under field conditions. This matters because combat effectiveness depends on the ability of ordinary soldiers in extraordinary situations to perform ordinary tasks. A weapon that requires specialist knowledge to maintain effectively is a weapon that degrades in combat when the specialists are casualties. The Bren's simplicity at the operational level meant that a trained infantry section maintained its automatic weapons capability even under conditions that removed trained gunners from the fight. The number 2 could pick up the weapon and continue. A rifleman who had trained on the Bren as part of standard infantry training could take over. The knowledge base was distributed across the section rather than concentrated in one specialist. German MG training, particularly for the MG-42, required significant investment of time to develop competent gunners who could exploit the weapon's characteristics while managing its limitations. Barrel changes at high cyclic rates required training and practice coordination between gunner and assistant. The belt feeding required attention and care under conditions where attention and care were in short supply. None of this made German MG teams ineffective. They were often very effective. But it did mean that attrition of trained personnel had consequences for German automatic weapons capability that the Bren's distributed training model helped Commonwealth units avoid. The post-war proliferation of the Bren is perhaps the most telling evidence of its genuine quality. After 1945, Bren guns dispersed across the world in numbers that reflected both the volume of wartime production and the weapon's reputation for effectiveness. Israel used Bren guns during the 1948 War of Independence and continued using them for years afterward. Indian military forces used them through the independence period and beyond, with the weapon eventually being rechambered in 7.62mm NATO for continued service. Various African nations that had been under British